Chapter 4. "So, tell me about this Neil person," said Will, as the three of them settled comfortably by the fire, steaming mugs of herb tea warming their cupped hands. "MacNeil," Horace corrected him. "He's a legend." "Oh, he's real enough," said Gillen. "I should know. I practiced under him for 5 years. I started when I was 11, then at 14 I was apprenticed to Halt. But he always gave me leave of absence to continue my sword work with the swordmaster." "But why did you continue to learn the sword after you started training as a ranger?" Horace asked. Gillen shrugged. "Maybe people thought it was a shame to waste all that early training. I certainly wanted to continue, and my father is Sir David of Caraway Fife, so I suppose I was given some leeway in the matter." Horace sat up a little straighter at the mention of the name. "Battlemaster David?" he said, obviously more than a little impressed. "The new Supreme Commander?" Gillen nodded, smiling at the boy's enthusiasm. "The same," he agreed. Then, seeing that Will was still in the dark, he explained further. "My father has been appointed Supreme Commander of the King's armies since Lord Northolt was murdered. He commanded the cavalry at the Battle of Hackham Heath." Will's eyes widened. "When Morgarath was defeated and driven into the mountains?" Both Horace and Gillen nodded. Horace continued the explanation enthusiastically. "Sir Rodney says his coordination of the cavalry with flanking archers in the final stage of the battle is a classic of its kind. He still teaches it as an example of perfect tactics. No wonder your father was chosen to replace Lord Northolt." Will realized that the conversation had moved away from its original gambit. "So what did your father have to do with this MacNeil character?" he asked, returning to the subject. "Well," said Gillen, "my father was his former pupil as well. It was only natural that MacNeil should gravitate to his battle school, wasn't it?" "I suppose so," Will agreed. "And it was only natural that I should come under his tutelage as soon as I could swing a sword. After all, I was the battlemaster's son." "So how was it that you became a ranger?" Horace asked. "Weren't you accepted as a knight?" Both rangers looked at him quizzically, somewhat amused by his assumption that a person only became a ranger after failing to become a knight or a warrior. In truth, it was only a short time since Will had felt the same way, but now he conveniently overlooked the fact. Horace became aware of the extended lull in the conversation, then of the looks they were giving him. All of a sudden he realized his gaffe and tried to recover. "I mean, you know, well, most of us want to be knights, don't we?" Will and Gillen exchanged glances. Gillen raised an eyebrow. Horace blundered on. "I mean, no offense or anything, but everyone I know wants to be a warrior." His embarrassment lessened as he pointed a forefinger at Will. "You did yourself, Will. I remember when we were kids, you used to always say you were going to battle school and you'd become a famous knight." Now it was Will's turn to feel uncomfortable. "And you always sneered at me, didn't you, and said I'd be too small?" he said. "Well, you were," said Horace with some heat. "Is that right?" Will replied angrily. "Well, does it occur to you that maybe Halt had already spoken to Sir Rodney and said he wanted me as an apprentice? That's the reason why I wasn't selected for battle school? Has that ever occurred to you?" Gillen interrupted at this point, gently stopping the argument before it got further out of hand. "I think that's enough of childhood squabbles," he said firmly. Both boys, each ready with another verbal barb, subsided a little awkwardly. "Oh, yeah, right," mumbled Will. "Sorry." Horace nodded several times, embarrassed at this petty scene that had just occurred. "Me too," he said. Then, curiosity piqued, he added, "Is that how it happened, Will? Did Halt tell Sir Rodney not to pick you because he wanted you for a ranger?" Will dropped his gaze and picked at a loose thread on his shirt. "Well, not exactly," he said, then admitted, "And you're right. I always did want to be a knight when I was a kid." Then, turning quickly to Gillen, he added, "But I wouldn't change that now, not for anything." Gillen smiled at the two of them. "I was the opposite," he said. "Remember, I grew up in the battle school. I may have started my training with MacNeil when I was 11, but I began my basic training around 9. "That must have been wonderful," Horace said with a sigh. Surprisingly, Gillen shook his head. "Not to me." You know what they say about distant pastures always looking greener? Both boys looked puzzled by this. It means you always want what you haven't got, he said, and they both nodded their understanding. Well, that's the way I was. By the time I was 12, I was sick to death of the discipline and drills and parades. He glanced sidelong at Horace. There's a bit of that goes on in battle school, you know. The heavy-set boy sighed. You're telling me, he agreed. But the horsemanship and practice combats are fun. Maybe, said Gillen, but I was more interested in the life the Rangers led. After Hackham Heath, my father and Halt had become good friends, and Halt used to come visiting. I'd see him come and go, so mysterious, so adventurous. I started to think what it might be like to come and go as you please, to live in the forests. People know so little about ranges. It seemed like the most exciting thing in the world to me. Horace looked doubtful. I've always been a little scared of Halt, he said. I used to think he was some kind of sorcerer. Will snorted in disbelief. Halt? A sorcerer? He said. He's nothing of the kind. Horace looked at him, pained once again. But you used to think the same thing, he said. Well, I suppose so, but I was only a kid then. So was I, replied Horace with devastating logic. Gillen grinned at the two of them. They were both still boys. Halt had been right, he thought. It was good for Will to be spending some time in company with someone his own age. Will turned to the older ranger. So did you ask Halt to take you as an apprentice? He asked. Then, before receiving any answer, continued, What did he say to that? Gillen shook his head. I didn't ask him for anything. I followed him one day and left our castle and headed into the forest. You followed him, a ranger. You followed a ranger into the forest, said Horace. He didn't know whether to be impressed by Gillen's courage or appalled at his foolhardiness. Will sprang to Gillen's defense. Gil's one of the best unseen movers in the Ranger Corps, he said quickly. The best, probably. I wasn't then, said Gillen ruefully. Mind you, I thought I knew a bit about moving without being seen. I found out how little I actually knew when I tried to sneak up on Halt when he stopped for a noon meal. Next thing I knew, his hand grabbed me by the scruff of my neck and threw me into a stream. He smiled at the memory of it. I suppose he sent you home in disgrace, then? Asked Horace, but Gillen shook his head again, a distant smile still on his face as he remembered that day. On the contrary, he kept me with him for a week, said I wasn't too bad at sneaking around in the forest, and I might have some talent at unseen movement. He started to teach me about being a ranger, and by the end of the week, I was his apprentice. So how did your father take it when you told him? Will asked. Surely he wanted you to be a knight like him. I guess he was disappointed. Not at all, said Gillen. The strange thing was, Halt had told him I'd probably be following him into the forest. My father had already agreed that if I could serve as Halt's apprentice, even before he knew I wanted to. Horace frowned. How could Halt have known that? Gillen shrugged and looked at Will meaningfully. Halt has a way of knowing things, doesn't he, Will? He asked, grinning. Will remembered that dark night in the Baron's office, and the hand that had shot out of the darkness to seize his wrist. Halt had been waiting for him that night, just as he'd obviously been waiting for Gillen to follow him. He looked deep into the low embers of the fire before he answered. Maybe, in his own way. He kinda is a sorcerer, he said. The three companions sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, thinking about what had been discussed. Then Gillen stretched and yawned. Well, I'm for sleep, he said. We're on war footing these days, so we'll set watches. Will, you're first, then Horace, then me. Night, you two. And so saying, he rolled himself into his gray-green cloak and was soon breathing deeply and evenly.